The moment the Dark King let go of her hand, the entire hall felt it not as a gesture, but as a verdict. His fingers withdrew slowly, deliberately, as if even touching her had become an inconvenience, and the silence that followed stretched just long enough for every noble, every guard, every whispering spectator to understand exactly what was happening. Then came the voice, cold and effortless, echoing beneath vaulted obsidian ceilings as he announced that this union was a mistake, that the throne demanded someone stronger, someone worthy of standing beside him. And with a single turn of his body, he reached for another woman waiting in the shadows. Laughter didn't erupt immediately, it spread, low and poisonous, crawling through the crowd like a living thing, feeding on her stillness as she stood abandoned at the altar, her pulse loud in her ears, her breath shallow, her entire world collapsing under the weight of a sentence spoken too easily. She tried to speak, to ask why, to demand anything that made sense of the humiliation burning through her chest, but no sound came, only the tightening of her throat as every gaze pressed into her like a blade. And then they began to watch her fall, not physically at first, but in the way her shoulders trembled, in the way her eyes lost focus, in the subtle shift from a bride to something lesser, something pitied or worse, something amusing. The nobles leaned closer, murmuring behind jeweled hands, already rewriting the story of this moment into something they could enjoy retelling, while the woman who had taken her place stepped forward with quiet confidence, her fingers slipping into the king's as though they had always belonged there. Heat flushed through her face, sharp and suffocating, and the sound of her own heartbeat became unbearable, each pulse a reminder that she was still standing there, still visible, still being judged. She lowered herself slowly, knees touching the cold stone floor not out of obedience, but because her body refused to hold the weight of what had just been taken from her. And for a brief, fragile second, she thought that was the end of it, that humiliation was the worst thing the night would offer. It wasn't, because the moment her tears touched the ground, the shadows beneath her moved. Not a trick of light, not the flicker of torches struggling against the vastness of the hall, but something deliberate, something that recoiled and then stretched, as if responding to a call no one else could hear. At first, it was subtle, a ripple, barely noticeable against the polished black floor. But then, it deepened, darkened, thickened in a way that made the nearest guards shift uneasily, their hands tightening on their weapons without understanding why. She felt it before she saw it fully, a strange, cold sensation coiling upward from the ground through her fingertips, threading into her veins like a second pulse, slower but infinitely heavier. Her breath caught, not in fear alone, but in confusion, because the darkness was not attacking her, not consuming her as every story warned it would. It was waiting for her. A murmur spread through the hall, different this time, edged with something sharper than mockery, something closer to unease, as the torches along the walls flickered in uneven rhythm, their flames bending ever so slightly toward where she knelt. The Dark King turned then, his expression tightening for the first time, his gaze dropping to the floor where the shadows no longer obeyed, the natural order of light, where they gathered too densely, too intentionally, pooling around her like a living cloak. He lifted his hand, almost reflexively, the gesture of someone accustomed to command, to control, to absolute obedience from the darkness that had built his reign. It did not answer him, and in that suspended breath, in that single impossible moment where power hesitated, every certainty in the room fractured at once. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of spectacle, but of something breaking beneath the surface of reality itself, slow and irreversible. The Dark King's hand remained suspended in the air, fingers slightly curled as if waiting for the shadows to rise and obey. Yet the darkness at her knees only thickened, folding inward like breath drawn too deep. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, subtle but unmistakable, and he lowered his hand with controlled precision, masking the failure before most could name it, but not before those closest to him saw the truth in that hesitation. She felt it again, that second pulse threading through her body. Stronger now, no longer a whisper, but a presence pressing outward from within, and when she lifted her head, her eyes no longer searched for mercy. They searched for understanding. A guard stepped forward, perhaps too eager, perhaps too afraid, his blade half drawn as he barked an order she barely heard, calling her a threat, an anomaly that should not be allowed to exist within the king's hall. The word spread quickly, anomaly passing from mouth to mouth until it gained weight, until it justified action, and the crowd shifted from entertained observers into something far more dangerous. She saw it happen in fragments. A noblewoman stepping back, a man reaching for a charm at his throat, the new bride tightening her grip on the king's arm, not in fear, but in calculation. The guard advanced another step, the edge of his blade catching the torchlight, and for a moment, everything narrowed to that single point of steel moving toward her. Then the shadow beneath him rose. It didn't strike like a weapon, nor lash like something wild, but it lifted slow, deliberate, forming around his feet before climbing upward in a fluid motion that defied shape, defied expectation, wrapping around his legs as if the darkness itself had chosen to hold him in place. His command broke mid-sentence, replaced by a sharp intake of breath as he tried to move and found resistance where none should exist. His boots anchored to a floor that moments ago had been nothing more than polished stone. Panic replaced authority almost instantly, his sword slipping from his grip as both hands clawed at something he could not grasp, something that left no mark and yet would not release him. She didn't move, not because she chose stillness, but because she didn't yet understand how movement related to what was happening, whether this power was hers to direct, or something merely passing through her like a storm searching for form. The darkness responded again, tightening slightly, not enough to harm, but enough to make the guard collapse to his knees with a strangled sound, his earlier confidence dissolving into raw fear. The hall erupted then, not into laughter this time, but into fragmented voices, overlapping commands, the scrape of steel as more guards moved forward, and then hesitated, caught between duty and the instinct to retreat from something that ignored every rule they understood. The Dark King stepped down from the dais. That alone was enough to silence the nearest voices, his presence cutting through the chaos with practiced dominance, each step measured, each movement deliberate, as though he could still impose order simply by existing within it. His gaze locked onto her, not with anger, but with something far more calculating, something that weighed, measured, and questioned. For the first time since the ceremony began, she felt truly seen, not as a bride, not as a failure, but as a variable he had not accounted for. The shadows at her knees shifted again, reacting to his approach, not retreating, not yielding, but adjusting, as though aware of him, as though recognizing something in him that demanded attention. "You will stand," he said, his voice low, controlled, carrying effortlessly across the hall, leaving no room for refusal. Her body hesitated, caught between instinct and something new rising within her, something that resisted the command without needing to defy it openly. Slowly, she pushed herself upright, her movements unsteady at first, then steadier as that strange internal current aligned with her breath, her balance, her awareness of the space around her. The darkness followed, not clinging, but expanding slightly, stretching outward in a thin veil that lingered just at the edges of perception, visible enough to unsettle, subtle enough to remain undeniable. She met his gaze fully now, and in that brief, electric connection, something passed between them, recognition, or perhaps the absence of it. "You should not exist like this," he continued, softer now, though no less dangerous, as if speaking a truth he had only just begun to understand. "This power is not yours to command." The words settled heavily in the air, and for a fraction of a second, doubt flickered through her, fragile and sharp, threatening to undo whatever fragile control she had gained. But beneath that doubt, deeper and older than her fear, something else stirred, something that rejected the premise entirely, not with defiance, but with quiet certainty. The shadows responded to that shift, tightening their presence around her feet once more, not aggressively, but protectively, as if reinforcing a truth she had not yet learned how to speak. Across the hall, the torches dimmed, not extinguished, not violently suppressed, but lowered, their flames bending inward, their light receding just enough to allow the darkness to breathe more freely, to expand in ways that made the air itself feel heavier. The nobles noticed it then, truly noticed it, their earlier composure cracking as the room itself began to change, as the boundaries between light and shadow blurred in ways no court ritual could explain. Someone whispered a name, old, uncertain, almost forgotten, and though the word was lost in the growing tension, its meaning lingered like a warning no one wanted to fully remember. The king heard it, and this time, he did not hide his reaction. A ripple of something dangerously close to recognition crossed the Dark King's face, and though it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, the damage had already been done. Those who knew him best had seen it. His control was not absolute here, not anymore, and the realization spread like a fracture beneath polished stone, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. He moved closer, each step deliberate, as though proximity might restore dominance, might reassert the natural order that had just been violated. But the shadows at her feet reacted before he even reached her, shifting, tightening, forming a thin barrier that did not touch him yet made its presence unmistakably clear. She felt it as a warning that wasn't meant for her. For him, the woman at his side, the one who had taken her place, watched in silence now. Her earlier composure, giving way to something colder, sharper, her eyes narrowing, as she studied the darkness with calculation rather than fear. She leaned in slightly, whispering something too low for most to hear, but the effect was immediate, the king's jaw tightening, his posture hardening, as if reminded of something he refused to forget. Power in this hall had never been about what was visible, it was about what could be controlled, contained, used, and whatever was happening now threatened all of it. Around them, the nobles had fallen into uneasy stillness, their earlier cruelty replaced by careful distance, as though proximity alone might make them part of something they could not survive. "You will leave this place," the Dark King said at last, his voice no longer carrying the effortless certainty it once had, but sharpened into something more forceful, more deliberate, as if volume could compensate for what had been lost. "You will go into exile, and you will not return. This is my decree." The words struck with the weight of law, of finality, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see if she would break under it, if she would bow, if she would accept the role he had just rewritten for her. The old instinct rose quickly, familiar and suffocating the urge to obey, to survive by yielding, to disappear quietly, and let the humiliation remain the worst thing she would carry. Her fingers trembled at her sides, her breath catching as that fragile instinct battled something new, something slower, deeper, that had begun to take root within her. And then, the shadows moved again. Not violently, not in defiance, but in refusal. They did not lash out, did not strike the king or the guards or anyone in the hall, but they drew closer to her, tightening their silent presence as though anchoring her in place, as though denying the very possibility of retreat. She felt it clearly now, not just as sensation, but as intention, as something that responded not to commands, but to her state, her hesitation, her fear. The realization came with a quiet clarity that cut through the chaos. This power did not want her to run. It wanted her to stay. A murmur rose again, quieter but far more dangerous than before, as the meaning of that stillness began to settle into the minds of those watching. Exile was not being accepted. The king's word was not being obeyed. That alone was enough to shift the balance of the entire room, to turn tension into something sharper, something that hovered on the edge of violence. The guards hesitated once more, awaiting a clearer command, while the nobles leaned back, instinctively widening the distance between themselves and the center of the hall, where something irreversible was unfolding. The Dark King's eyes darkened, not with rage, but with calculation pushed to its limit, as though he were tracing every possibility and finding each one lacking. His connection to the shadows, once effortless, unquestioned, now felt strained, distant, like a voice echoing from too far away to be relied upon. He raised his hand again, slower this time, more deliberate, drawing upon the full extent of his will, the authority that had never failed him before. And for a moment, the shadows at the edges of the hall stirred in response, faint but noticeable, a reminder that his power had not vanished entirely. But around her, they did not move. They held. And in that contrast, in that visible fracture between what he could still command and what he could not, the truth sharpened into something undeniable. She saw it in his eyes then, in the brief, unguarded second where certainty gave way to something far more dangerous. Doubt. It flickered just once, and she felt it. Not as a victory, not yet, but as a shift. A subtle realignment of something far larger than the two of them. Something that had begun the moment he let go of her hand and could no longer be undone. The second pulse within her steadied, deepened, sinking with her breath, her heartbeat, her awareness of every shadow in the room, each one now a thread she could almost feel, almost follow, almost understand. Almost. Across the hall, one of the older nobles took a step back, his face pale, his voice barely more than a whisper as he spoke again. Louder this time, the forgotten name returning with clearer shape, heavier meaning, something dredged up from history that had been buried for a reason. The origin. The word spread more quickly than before, catching, repeating, distorting as it moved from one mouth to another, until it reached the king once more, not as a whisper, but as a statement that demanded to be either crushed or confirmed. His gaze snapped toward the speaker, sharp and dangerous, but he did not deny it. He couldn't, because deep beneath the surface of everything he had built, everything he controlled, everything he believed was his by right, something ancient had just stirred, and it did not recognize him as its master. It recognized her. The word did not fade, it settled, heavy and irreversible, pressing into the bones of the hall as though the very stones remembered something the living had tried to forget. Faces shifted, not in unison, but in fragments. Confusion, denial, calculation, each expression revealing a different stage of the same realization creeping through the court. The Dark King did not move immediately, and in that stillness, his silence spoke louder than any command he could have given, because he had always been quick to crush dissent, to erase uncertainty before it could take shape. Now he stood there, eyes fixed on her, measuring something that no longer fit within the boundaries of his control, and the longer he hesitated, the more the balance of power tilted in ways no one had prepared for. She felt the shift as clearly as she felt her own breath, a subtle reorientation of everything around her, as though the world had quietly adjusted its center. The shadows no longer pressed tightly at her feet, they expanded, not outward in aggression, but in presence, threading across the floor in thin, deliberate lines that reached toward the pillars, the walls, the spaces between those who watched. It was not an attack, it was a claim, a slow, undeniable assertion that something here belonged to her. In a way, it did not belong to anyone else. Her fingers curled slightly, not out of fear now, but in response to that strange internal current that had begun to feel less foreign with every passing second, less like something happening to her, and more like something waking up. "You speak of things you do not understand," the Dark King said at last, his voice cutting through the murmurs with sharpened authority, reclaiming ground with precision rather than force. His gaze swept across the court briefly, silencing the lingering whispers, before returning to her with renewed focus, colder now, more dangerous, as if he had made a decision he would not allow himself to question. "There is no origin beyond what I command. There is no power here that does not answer to me." The declaration rang with practiced certainty, and for a moment, it almost re-established the fragile illusion that had begun to fracture. But the shadows betrayed him again. Not dramatically, not in open defiance, but in the smallest, most devastating way. They did not respond. The torches flickered unevenly, their light bending inward once more, and the thin threads of darkness, that had spread across the floor did not retreat, did not dissolve, did not acknowledge his claim in any way. It was not rebellion. It was indifference. A sharp breath broke from somewhere in the crowd, quickly stifled, but the damage was done, the sound echoing louder than it should have, because it marked the exact moment fear replaced loyalty. The nobles did not move closer to him, they moved subtly away, their bodies angling just enough to create distance, their instincts betraying their allegiance. Power had always been something they aligned with, not something they questioned. And now that power had begun to split, to show seams where none had existed before. The woman at his side noticed it too. Her grip on his arm tightened, not in support, but in restraint, as though anchoring herself to the last stable point in a shifting world, her eyes never leaving the one who had replaced her at the altar. There was no pity there now, no satisfaction, only calculation sharpened by urgency, as if she were already adjusting her expectations, rewriting her role in a story that had just changed direction without warning. She leaned closer again, her voice a breath against his ear. But this time, whatever she said did not bring calm. It sharpened something darker in his expression, something edged with resolve. "Seize her," he ordered, the command quiet but absolute, directed not at the room, but at the guards who still lingered at the edge of action. This time, they moved, not with confidence, not with the clean precision of soldiers acting under unquestioned authority, but with tension coiled into every step, their eyes flickering toward the floor, toward the shadows that had already proven themselves unpredictable. They advanced in a widening arc, cautious, blades drawn but held slightly too tight, as though expecting resistance from something they could not see clearly. The distance between them and her closed slowly, each step stretching time thinner, pulling the moment taut with expectation. She did not step back, not because she had chosen courage, but because something within her had begun to reject the idea of retreat entirely, as though the concept itself no longer applied. The second pulse steadied further, aligning with something deeper, something older than her fear. And when the first guard crossed the invisible threshold where the shadows had spread, the reaction was immediate. The darkness surged not violently, not chaotically, but with precise, controlled intent, rising in narrow streams that intercepted movement rather than striking at it, wrapping around wrists, ankles, blades, halting progress with an efficiency that left no room for misunderstanding. Steel hit stone, one sword, then another, slipping free from hands that could no longer maintain their grip, not because they were forced open, but because the strength simply left them. The guards froze, caught mid-motion, their bodies resisting commands their muscles could no longer obey, their breaths turning shallow as realization replaced instinct. This was not something they could fight. This was something that decided, and it had decided against them. The Dark King took one step forward, just one, but it was enough to shift everything again, because unlike the others, he did not hesitate, did not falter, did not allow the visible defiance of the shadows to slow him. His presence pressed outward, heavy, suffocating. The weight of years of absolute rule condensed into a single advancing motion, and for the first time since the anomaly began, the shadows reacted differently. They did not retreat, but they tightened, condensed, their fluid spread drawing inward toward her, as though preparing for something more focused, more deliberate. He stopped, just short of her, close enough that the distance between them no longer belonged to the room, but to something far more dangerous, something that existed entirely between the two of them. His gaze dropped briefly to the shadows gathered at her feet, then lifted back to her face, searching, not for weakness now, but for confirmation. "Look at me," he said, quieter than before, but far more intense, the command threading through the air with a different kind of force, one that did not rely solely on power, but on something older, something tied to the very nature of what he controlled. Her body responded before her mind did. Slowly, almost against her own will, her eyes lifted to meet his fully, and in that instant, the world seemed to narrow, the noise of the hall fading into something distant and irrelevant. The shadows stilled, not gone, not weakened, but held in a suspended state, as though waiting for the outcome of something that had nothing to do with movement, nothing to do with force, something deeper. "You feel it, don't you?" he said. And this time there was no attempt to hide what lay beneath his words. "That connection, that pull, it does not belong to you." For a fraction of a second, the doubt returned, sharper this time, because his voice carried something that resonated with what she felt, something that almost made sense of the chaos inside her. The second pulse wavered, just slightly, the shadows at her feet flickering in response, their cohesion thinning for the briefest moment. Almost enough. But then, beneath that flicker, beneath the uncertainty he tried to anchor within her, something else rose, something steadier, quieter, but infinitely more certain. Not a rejection of his words, not a denial, but a realization that cut deeper than either. He was wrong, not about the connection, but about who it belonged to. The realization did not arrive as a sudden burst of clarity, but as something slower, heavier, settling into place with a quiet inevitability that could not be undone. It spread through her like a second breath, deeper than the first, aligning every trembling fragment of her body into something steadier, something that no longer reacted but understood. The doubt he had planted flickered once more, then collapsed under the weight of that understanding, and with it, the fragile imbalance within her corrected itself. The shadows responded instantly, not surging, not lashing out, but stabilizing, their presence sharpening into something precise, something that no longer wavered between uncertainty and instinct. His eyes narrowed. Have felt it. Not the loss, because he had not yet accepted that word, but the shift, the subtle closing of a door he had expected to force open. Whatever influence he had tried to exert, whatever thread he had attempted to pull within her, had slipped from his grasp without resistance, without struggle, as though it had never truly belonged to him to begin with. For the first time since he stepped down from the dais, something in his composure cracked, not visibly, not in a way the court could easily name, but in the tightening of his gaze, in the way his breath paused just slightly too long between words. "You misunderstand what you're touching," he said, more sharply now, the control in his voice reinforced with something closer to urgency. "Power without mastery destroys itself. It always has." The warning lingered, heavier than before, not as a threat, but as something dangerously close to truth. And for a brief moment, the shadows reacted not in obedience, but in awareness, their edges trembling, as if recognizing the weight of those words. The hall seemed to lean inward again, the tension sharpening, stretching thin as every witness waited to see whether that truth would take hold, whether she would falter under it, whether the fragile balance would collapse into something he could reclaim. She exhaled, and the shadows breathed with her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it rippled outward from her in a slow, controlled wave, the darkness rising just enough to redefine the space around her, not expanding in chaos, but in quiet alignment. The guards, still trapped in place, felt it first, their bodies stiffening further as whatever held them tightened, not painfully, but with unmistakable certainty. The nobles followed, their whispers dying completely now, replaced by a silence that carried something heavier than fear. Recognition. She took a step forward. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but it shifted the entire room, because this time, the shadows did not follow. They adjusted ahead of her, parting slightly, shaping the path before she moved, as though anticipating rather than reacting. It was no longer a question of control. It was alignment. The Dark King did not retreat, but he did not advance either. For the first time, distance existed between them, not as a measure of space, but as a boundary neither of them crossed, because something far more complex had taken its place. His connection to the shadows flickered again, weaker now, inconsistent, like a flame struggling against unseen pressure. And though he forced it into stillness, forced his presence to remain dominant, the fracture had already deepened. "You think this makes you something more," he said, quieter now, the sharpness in his tone tempered by something colder, more calculating. But power does not choose. It is taken, controlled, bent. Each word landed with deliberate weight, but beneath them, something else threaded through something he had not allowed anyone to hear before. Uncertainty. Her gaze held his, steady now, unflinching, not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous: absence of submission. The second pulse within her had fully settled, no longer foreign, no longer separate, but integrated into every part of her awareness, and with it came something she had not expected: memory. Not her own. Fragments surfaced at the edges of her mind, indistinct but persistent echoes of darkness, not as something feared, but something shaped, something born from will older than the throne standing before her. The sensation was fleeting, incomplete, but enough to shift her understanding, enough to anchor the certainty that had begun to form. The shadows did not feel like power she had gained. They felt like something returning. A tremor ran through the hall, subtle but undeniable, as the torches dimmed further, their light shrinking back as though conceding space, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the thick stone walls of the palace, thunder rolled not from a storm, but from something deeper. Something answering a call that had not been heard in a very long time. The sound reached the hall as a low, distant echo, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet, threading into the silence like a warning, or a promise. The Dark King heard it, and this time, he could not hide his reaction, because for the first time since his reign began, something in the world had moved, without his command. The echo of that distant thunder did not fade, it settled into the marrow of the hall, a low, persistent vibration that made every breath feel heavier, every heartbeat more deliberate, as though the world itself had shifted into a slower, more watchful rhythm. No one spoke now. Even the guards, still bound by the unseen hold of the shadows, had stopped struggling, their fear no longer frantic but frozen, as if instinct had finally understood what reason could not. Resistance was meaningless here. The nobles stood rigid along the edges, their earlier arrogance stripped away, replaced by the quiet calculation of those who knew they were witnessing the collapse of something foundational, something they had built their entire existence around. At the center of it all, she stood, without trembling, not because the fear had vanished, but because it had been redefined, reshaped into something that no longer controlled her movements, no longer dictated her choices. The fragments in her mind sharpened, aligning just enough to form patterns, impressions of vast, endless darkness that was not empty, but full, alive with intention, shaped not by domination, but by origin. The sensation deepened as she breathed, each inhale pulling that awareness further into her, each exhale grounding it, stabilizing it, until the line between herself and the shadows blurred in a way that felt less like possession and more like recognition. The Dark King stepped forward again. This time, the shadows did not tighten in warning. They stilled. The difference was subtle, but absolute, because it marked the moment where reaction ceased entirely, replaced by something far more deliberate. He crossed the boundary that had held the others back, his presence pressing into the space around her with the full weight of his authority, his will reaching outward, not crudely, not forcefully, but with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering control over what others feared. The air seemed to bend slightly around him, the faintest ripple of darkness, answering his approach, not in obedience, but in acknowledgement. For a moment, it almost looked like balance. "You feel it returning," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of performance, of command, meant for an audience, directed only at her. "That is not awakening. That is inheritance, and inheritance can be claimed." The words carried a different kind of danger, one not rooted in threat, but in implication, and the fragments in her mind reacted, shifting, stirring, in response to something deeper within them. For the first time since the anomaly began, the shadows did not simply align with her, they wavered, subtly, their edges softening as if responding to a second influence, one that moved not from within her, but toward her, his. The realization struck sharply, cutting through her steadying focus, because this was different from before. He was not trying to command the shadows directly. He was reaching for the source beneath them, the same place those fragments had begun to form, the same place where her certainty had rooted itself. It was not control he was exerting. It was claim. The hall seemed to tighten around them, the silence compressing into something almost unbearable as the unseen tension between them intensified, stretching thin as a blade's edge. The shadows at her feet flickered again, not violently, but uncertainly, caught between two gravitational pulls that did not oppose each other in force, but in origin. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition of what was happening, of what he was trying to do, to redefine her place within what she had just begun to understand. For a fraction of a second, the balance tipped. The darkness around her thinned, ever so slightly, enough that the nearest guard managed a sharp inhale, enough that the torchlight reclaimed a fraction of space it had lost. It was small, almost imperceptible, but in a room balanced on the edge of transformation, it was everything. The Dark King felt it immediately, his focus sharpening, his presence pressing harder, not outward, but inward, toward that unseen center where the fragments within her had begun to take shape. "Yes," he murmured. Softer now, the first hint of something almost like certainty returning to his tone. "You see it. You understand. This does not make you above it. It binds you to it." The words slipped deeper than before, threading through the fragments, aligning with something they almost resembled, and for a moment, the clarity she had found threatened to fracture again, threatened to bend into something that fit his version of truth instead of her own. The second pulse within her stuttered, just once, the shadows flickering in response, their steady presence destabilizing into something uncertain. Almost enough. But beneath that wavering, deeper than the fragments, deeper than the voice that sought to shape them, something else remained untouched. Not memory, not power. Origin. It rose without force, without resistance, simply existing in a way that did not require defense, because it had never been something that could be taken. The fragments shifted again, but this time they did not align with his words. They aligned with that deeper certainty, snapping into place not as pieces of something broken, but as parts of something whole. The shadows surged, not outward, inward. They collapsed toward her in a single, silent motion, not consuming, not overwhelming, but condensing into a presence so dense, so complete, that the space around her seemed to warp slightly, light bending at its edges, as though reality itself adjusted to accommodate it. The flicker of uncertainty vanished instantly, replaced by something far more absolute, something that did not react to his influence because it existed beyond it. The Dark King froze, not in fear, in realization, because what he had tried to claim had not resisted him. It had simply not recognized him. The pressure he exerted faltered, not from lack of strength, but from absence of connection, and in that precise moment, the fragile balance shattered completely. The shadows did not push him back, did not strike, did not retaliate. They ignored him, flowing around his presence as though it were no longer central to their existence, as though it never had been. Her eyes lifted fully to his, steady, unshaken, and for the first time since the ceremony began, there was no trace of the woman who had been left at the altar, no echo of the humiliation that had defined her moments ago. In its place was something quieter, deeper, something that did not need to prove itself, something that simply was. The hall exhaled, though no one realized they had been holding their breath, and in that collective, unconscious release, the truth settled into every corner of the room, into every mind that had witnessed the shift. The throne did not define the power. The power had never belonged to the throne, and now it had chosen where it stood. The realization did not erupt into chaos, it settled, quiet and suffocating, like ash falling after a fire no one had seen begin, coating every surface with the weight of what could no longer be denied. The nobles did not speak, because there was nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to soften into rumor or reshape into something harmless. They had watched power shift without spectacle, without violence, and that made it far more dangerous, because it meant the change was not temporary, not a fluctuation to be corrected, but a correction itself. The guards remained frozen where they stood, not by force alone, but by the collapse of certainty, their training offering no guidance for a world where command no longer guaranteed obedience. The Dark King drew a slow breath. It was controlled, measured, but it carried something new beneath it. Something that had not existed in him moments before. Not fear, not yet, but awareness of a limit he had never needed to acknowledge. His gaze did not leave her, not even as the silence thickened, not even as the distance between them redefined itself into something far more complex than space. He studied her as one might study a fracture in something once believed unbreakable, tracing its edges, testing its depth, searching for a way to contain it before it spread too far. "You will not leave this hall alive," he said finally, and though the words were quiet, they landed with the weight of finality, stripped of ceremony, stripped of performance, reduced to the simplest form of power he still possessed: decision. There was no audience in his voice now, no need to convince, only the cold certainty of a man who had built his reign on the elimination of threats before they could fully take shape. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the air changed, not violently, not with the sudden pressure of force, but with a subtle tightening, as though the space itself had begun to listen, to lean toward what was about to happen. The shadows at her feet did not surge in response to his threat. They deepened, their presence condensing further, not in preparation to strike, but in quiet readiness, as if awaiting a choice that had not yet been made. She felt it clearly now, the difference between reaction and intent, between something that answered instinct and something that required decision. And for the first time, the choice was hers. The fragments in her mind aligned again, sharper now, clearer, no longer disjointed impressions, but echoes of something vast and coherent, something that did not demand control, because it had never been separate from itself. The sensation was not overwhelming. It was grounding. It settled into her bones, into her breath, into the rhythm of her pulse, until the line between what she was and what she carried ceased to exist entirely. She stepped forward again. This time, the shadows did not move ahead of her. They moved with her. The distinction was subtle, but absolute, because it marked the moment where alignment became unity, where there was no longer a question of whether they would respond, because there was nothing left to respond to. They were already part of the same motion. The guards nearest her felt it immediately, their bodies locking completely, their breath halting as the darkness around their limbs tightened just enough to remove the possibility of resistance entirely. No pain, no struggle, only stillness. The Dark King moved at the same time, faster than before, without hesitation, without calculation visible to the eye, closing the distance between them in a single, controlled motion that carried the full force of everything he still commanded. The shadows reacted, but not as they had with the others. They did not intercept him immediately, did not halt his advance, but shifted, condensing more tightly around her, as though recognizing that what approached was not something to be stopped in the same way. He reached for her, and for a fraction of a second, everything narrowed to that single point of contact, the space between his hand and her arm, where two understandings of power collided not in force, but in origin. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, the world broke, not outward, inward. The shadows did not explode, did not lash out, did not consume the hall in darkness, as fear might have expected. Instead, they collapsed again, compressing into a density that bent perception itself, pulling everything toward that single point of contact, as though reality had folded around it. The torches dimmed to embers. The sound in the room vanished completely, and for a heartbeat that stretched into something infinite, nothing existed beyond the connection between them. Then it expanded, silently. The force did not throw him back, did not strike him down, but it severed something intangible, something that had once linked him to the darkness he commanded. It happened without spectacle, without visible rupture, but the effect was immediate, absolute. His hand recoiled not from pain, but from absence, from the sudden, impossible void where connection had once existed. His power was gone, not weakened. Gone. The realization hit him with a clarity that stripped away every layer of control he had built, every certainty he had relied on, leaving only the bare truth beneath it. The shadows did not acknowledge him anymore, not even as something to resist, not even as something to ignore. He was no longer part of them. A sound broke the silence, not from the crowd, from him. A single, quiet breath, sharper than it should have been, carrying the first true fracture of something deeper than power. Disbelief. She stood before him unchanged in form, unchanged in posture, yet entirely unrecognizable in presence. The darkness around her no longer shifting, no longer reacting, but existing in perfect, unwavering stillness, as though it had finally reached the state it had always been moving toward. There was no strain in her expression, no effort in her stance, no sign of the struggle that had defined every moment before this. Only certainty. The hall remained frozen, every witness caught in the aftermath of something they could not yet fully comprehend, because what had just happened was not a display of strength. It was a correction, and in that correction, everything the Dark King had built lost its foundation in a single, silent instant. For a long moment, no one moved, as though the world itself had paused to confirm what had just been rewritten, testing the edges of a reality that no longer aligned with memory. The Dark King remained where he stood, his hand lowered now, fingers slightly curled as if still searching for something that had already slipped beyond reach, his breath measured but uneven, in a way that could not be hidden. The absence around him was not visible, not something the court could point to, but it pressed into the space like a vacuum, an unmistakable void where authority had once radiated without question. And the longer it lingered, the clearer it became this was not a temporary loss, not a disruption that could be reclaimed with force or will. It was final. She felt it too, not as victory, not as triumph, but as silence complete and absolute, the kind that follows when something long contested simply resolves. The shadows no longer pulsed with uncertainty, no longer tested boundaries or sought alignment. They rested, vast and endless, folded into her presence without resistance, without demand, as though they had returned to a state they had been denied for far too long. The fragments in her mind were no longer fragments. They had settled into something whole, something that did not overwhelm her, because it had never been separate from her to begin with. Across the hall, someone dropped to their knees. The sound was soft, almost lost in the weight of the moment, but it carried farther than any command had, because it marked the first conscious acknowledgement of what had changed. One noble, then another, then a third, each movement hesitant at first, then certain, as instinct overrode pride, as survival recognized what allegiance could not yet accept. The shift spread unevenly, rippling through the court not as a unified act, but as a series of individual decisions, each one carving deeper into the foundation of the world that had existed moments before. Not all followed. A few remained standing, rigid, unwilling or unable to bend, their loyalty to the throne clinging to the shape of what had been, even as it crumbled around them. Among them stood the woman who had taken her place, her posture unyielding, her gaze fixed forward, not with denial, but with something far more dangerous calculation sharpened into resolve. She stepped forward slowly, her voice cutting through the silence with a clarity that refused to yield to fear. "This changes nothing," she said, though the faint tightening in her tone betrayed the strain beneath the words. "A throne is not undone by a trick of shadow." The statement hung in the air, fragile against the weight of what had already been witnessed, but it served its purpose, anchoring those who still needed something to hold on to, something that resembled the order they understood. The few who remained standing shifted subtly, their uncertainty hardening into something more defensive, more desperate, as if repetition alone could restore what had been lost. The Dark King did not respond to her. He did not move to reclaim the moment, did not raise his voice, did not attempt to reassert control in the ways he always had. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the one before him, Not with anger, not even with the cold calculation he had worn so easily, but with something far more exposed, something that had no place in the image he had built. Understanding. "You were never meant to stand beside me," he said at last, the words quiet, stripped of pretense, spoken not as a decree, but as a realization that had arrived too late to change anything. "You were meant to replace me." The truth settled heavily between them, not as a threat, but as something inevitable, something that had been set in motion long before either of them had understood its shape. The hall seemed to contract around that admission, the final piece aligning with everything that had unfolded, leaving no space for doubt, no room for reinterpretation. She did not answer immediately, not because she lacked words, but because the answer no longer needed to be spoken in the way it once had. The silence itself carried it, supported by the stillness of the shadows, by the bowed heads scattered across the floor, by the absence that surrounded the man who had once commanded absolute power. When she finally stepped forward again, closing the remaining distance between them, there was no resistance, no barrier, no force rising to stop her. Only space. And in that space, everything that had defined her moments before, the humiliation, the abandonment, the quiet desperation, had no place left to exist. She stopped, just short of him, close enough that the difference between them could no longer be measured by distance, but by what remained and what had been taken away. Her gaze held his, steady and unbroken, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, not connection, not understanding, but acknowledgement of the same truth seen from opposite sides. "You took something that was never yours," she said, her voice calm, unstrained, carrying effortlessly through the silent hall. "And you built a kingdom on it." There was no accusation in her tone, no anger, no need to wound him with what he had already begun to understand. The words existed simply as fact, as the final articulation of what had been revealed. The shadows stirred faintly at her feet, not in response to emotion, but in quiet affirmation, their presence grounding the truth rather than amplifying it. Behind her, the nobles who had knelt lowered their heads further, not in fear, in recognition. The Dark King exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, yet carrying more weight than any command he had ever given. There was no denial left in him now, no path back to what had been, only the quiet unraveling of a certainty he had never imagined losing. For the first time, he did not stand as a ruler, or as a force to be reckoned with. He stood as a man who had reached the end of something, and understood it. The understanding did not grant him peace. It stripped him of everything that had once made peace irrelevant, leaving him exposed to a silence he had never learned to endure. The hall held that silence like a sealed chamber, every breath contained within it, every witness caught between the instinct to flee and the need to see what came next. Power had shifted, but its consequence had not yet been decided, and that uncertainty pressed into the space with a weight that made even stillness feel unstable. She saw it in him then, not as weakness, but as absence the hollow left behind when something fundamental is removed too cleanly to leave scars. The Dark King did not reach for the shadows again, did not test the void that now surrounded him, because he already understood the answer he would find. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on her, steady despite everything, as if the last fragment of his identity rested in the act of witnessing what he had lost. "You think this ends with you standing where I once stood," he said, his voice quieter now, not diminished, but altered, stripped of the certainty that had once defined it. "But power like this does not settle. It consumes. It demands more than you understand." The warning lingered, not as manipulation, but as something closer to memory, echoes of a truth he had lived, shaped, perhaps even feared in ways he had never spoken aloud. The court shifted uneasily at his words, because they offered something dangerously familiar. The idea that what had just happened was not a resolution, but the beginning of something far more difficult to control. She felt the weight of it, not as doubt, not as hesitation, but as awareness of scale, of the vastness beneath what had awakened within her, of the depth she had only begun to touch. The shadows at her feet did not react to his warning, did not ripple with unease or surge with defiance. They remained steady, grounded, as if his understanding of them belonged to a version of the world that no longer applied. Behind her, movement broke the stillness. The woman who had stood beside the throne stepped forward again, no longer masking her intent. Her composure sharpened into something decisive. In her hand, a blade caught the dim torchlight, its edge thin and precise, its purpose unmistakable. She did not rush, did not shout, did not draw attention with anything but the inevitability of her movement, closing the distance with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that hesitation would cost her everything. A few nobles gasped. Too late. The strike came clean and direct, aimed not at the king, but at her, the one who now stood at the center of everything. The blade cut through the air, with a precision born of training and desperation, its path unbroken, its intent absolute. And then it stopped. Not against steel, not against flesh, against nothing. The shadow between them thickened in an instant, not rising, not striking, but simply existing with such density that the blade could not pass through it, its motion halting, as if reality itself had refused to allow it forward. The force of the strike did not dissipate, it redirected, shuddering back through the woman's arm, forcing her to stagger as the weapon slipped from her grip, clattering against the stone with a sharp, final sound. She froze, not from fear alone, but from the realization that there had been no resistance, no impact, nothing she could understand or fight against. The hall reacted in fragments, sharp breaths, shifting feet, the instinctive retreat of those who had remained standing as the last illusion of control shattered completely. There was no longer any space left to pretend that what had happened could be contained, reversed, or dismissed as anomaly. It was absolute. The woman who had attacked took a step back, then another, her composure cracking at last, her gaze flicking between the fallen blade and the unmoving figure before her, searching for some sign of weakness, some flaw in what she had just encountered. She found none. The shadows did not move toward her. They did not need to, because the message had already been delivered. She was not a threat. She never had been. The Dark King closed his eyes briefly. It was a small gesture, easily missed, but it carried the weight of something final, the last moment of resistance, giving way to acceptance, not forced, not broken, but chosen because there was nothing left to deny. When he opened them again, the last trace of the ruler he had been was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that did not seek to reclaim what had been lost. "You don't understand what they will make of you," he said, not looking at the woman who had attacked, not addressing the court, but speaking only to her. "What they will need you to become." The words settled differently than before, not as a warning against the power itself, but against the world that would now shape itself around it, the expectations that would follow, the demands that would rise from every corner of what had just been overturned. The nobles, still kneeling, still watching, embodied that truth already, their submission not born of loyalty, but of necessity, of the need to align with whatever now defined survival. She turned slightly, just enough to see them. Rows of bowed heads. Not devotion. Dependence. The realization came with a quiet weight that matched his words, settling into the space where certainty had just taken root. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything that would follow. When she faced him again, her expression had not hardened, had not shifted into something cold or distant, but there was something new within it, something that recognized the path ahead, not as a burden, but as something that could not be avoided. "I understand enough," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying not just through the hall, but through the silence that had claimed it. More than you ever allowed yourself to. There was no challenge in her tone, only truth. The shadows stirred faintly, not in response to her words, but in quiet alignment with them, as though acknowledging a direction that had already been chosen, a future that had already begun to take shape. And for the first time since the ceremony began, nothing in the hall resisted her. Not the nobles, not the guards, not the darkness, not even the man who had once ruled it all. The throne stood behind him, unchanged in form, yet emptied of meaning, its presence reduced to something symbolic, something that no longer held the weight it once commanded, because what had defined it had already moved on.